Okay, we have the for this we're going to put our Patreon up first for those interested. I've explained this before that there's a that the higher you donate, the more priority your choices are going to be for the topics, and that will be suggested. Though when you go up to the $50 and $100 levels on the Patreon, it will once we reach a threshold, it will be the $50 one will be a giveaway for a Roman silver coin, and the $100 level will be a giveaway for a Byzantine gold coin. Now, that being said, you can click on that for donating. I would really appreciate every single dollar donated. It really helps me, as you can see that I'm on disability with that. And that being said, we can get on to the actual topic. Now, this is actually based on what I actually found on a comment on Twitter with kind of a banter back and forth on the idea of freedom of press. And they were basically trying to argue that on the point of view of Assange, that even if the points that even if the documents were fully lawful to release, that he should not be able to release them. Because that's not releasing government documents is not journalism, and if we take that and no one should be able to release government documents or publish them. And this is actually a very dangerous stance, because this would mean this actual stance is actually kind of different from what we actually find in the actual from what the actual current stance is on our government itself. Now, we actually have different types of documents currently, and this is regardless of what type of thing would fall under being classified, unclassified, or no classification at all. This could mean even something as simple as as for doing your tax forms. This means that you would not have access to instructions for your tax forms. The only thing they could actually distribute would be your actual raw tax forms themselves. And that you would actually, for the instructions, you would actually have to go out to the actual online calculators. They cannot tell you how anything was figured out. You cannot do it by hand. You would actually have to go to online calculators for this, set up by the Internal Revenue Service. And they could not tell you the way this was figured out, because this would essentially not be a right of the people on this basis of what would be proclaimed, because this would essentially only be a right of the government and its government personnel only. And this is why we proclaim this as being a very dangerous idea, because it would extend to all documents, not just classified documents being released by the by journalists, but also unclassified and no classification thereof. And that means it doesn't matter if the government wants to release it. The government could theoretically not be allowed to release it, because there would be no allowance for these people to see these documents. And that's what that precedent would be set at, and that's something that would be very dangerous. And it would that's where it sits at a very different stance. Now, the person did not have any idea of what the constitutional position was that number one, the government cannot claim of who has the freedom of press as number one, as that is a right, and they do not understand that of what the idea of when you actually set out documents of what actually happens with that's when you actually send out documents that has actually been done before, and that people have been declared as members of the press. We've done that before. It's actually been done before many times. You do not necessarily have to do analysis. Analysis is only one aspect of the press, and the press isn't just doing secondary sources, and many times as they're giving out primary sources. That's a lot of that's many times one portion of what the press does. But the press is actually the corporate press has actually been very, very lazy in doing this over the years, and they have not been doing this recently, because they've kind of become more of this arm of government propaganda. And if you look at that, and that's where people like Julian Assange with WikiLeaks have kind of changed this. So if we look at this idea of if one is not allowed to put government document, if nobody's allowed to have access except government personnel of classified, unclassified, or no classification for documents except for government personnel, this would mean that it would make it nearly impossible to live, and they could essentially declare anything out there. They could essentially declare that everyone, that when it comes to the actual government budget, you could never see the government budget. They could never actually disclose this. They wouldn't even have to disclose anything. The only time where it actually could be disclosed is if a member of the government themselves actually told anybody any features of the government budget, because it would never have to be released. Other things as well, this would mean that the State of the Union address would never have to be released. They could essentially say, we're not doing a State of the Union address on TV. We're only going to write it on paper, and we're going to give it to the members of Congress. We're not going to give it to the media, because technically that's all you have to do. You don't even have to give it to the media. Now this would technically be lawful, and because based on this thing of stating that you don't have to give any of these classifications out there, and this would essentially block all other people of seeing it, and that's what ends up happening. Now, this is why we do not create that, because that essentially is a tyranny, because you're essentially creating two separate classes of people. You're essentially creating one class of people, which is the government, and the government essentially can essentially have access to all this stuff and to all this information. Now, essentially, the terms of no classification, unclassified, and classified would essentially, in this case, have no difference. The only differences would actually apply to people in government themselves, because when it comes down to that, it would no longer have any legitimacy when it comes down to actually a functionality of the actual government itself and how these documents are treated. Because when it comes down to the actual people outside of government, nobody would be permitted to have these documents. Not one person. And if anybody were actually had access to these documents, they'd automatically be considered, it would not be considered a right to have those documents. and they would essentially could be pursued legally based on those standards, just like people are saying they should go after Assange. If we're going to go with this perception, and this is why we view this. This is why we need to view this actual aspect, and it's something that is a very, very important question to ask: is do we want this? Do we want this actual perception? Now, if we go with this perception, you're talking that no members of the media nor no members of society, other than government personnel, would have any access to any information of what the government does. Now, the government would technically only have to tell the media and society only what it wants to. Now, for people that are actually in the know, they should realize what this is called. This is called propaganda. And when you have propaganda, that's actually a big problem. And we should understand this. This is actually a huge issue. And we should actually be guarding against this, because you're going to have propaganda in all nations. And every nation is going to have an issue with propaganda. And to avoid this, we should actually be looking at trying to kill propaganda. And that's something that should be very, very important to people. And if you go with a situation like this, you're essentially saying the only thing that comes out is propaganda. And that's basically, you're essentially going into a complete and utter statist society, such as the Soviet Union, such as China, North Korea, whatever nation that you want to assume as, that have actually been run like that. Because that's all you're going to get, is you're just going to get propaganda coming right out. Because you're not going to get anything else, because it's going to block everything else. And because the whole idea is you're not going to have access to any other information. This is why when you go to the constitutional position goes in the complete opposite, and states that while the person who gathered such information could be subject to criminal prosecution based on the situation, the actual members of the actual journalists themselves are not subject to this because of their rights under the First Amendment. And this is why we cannot go in the direction like that. We cannot go and say, oh, we want to start prosecuting people like that. That's why going after someone like an Assange is actually a very, very dangerous idea, because this is actually what we need to go into. We need to go into the idea of that, and it's a very dangerous idea, because it states that you now can actually start prosecuting people that you don't like. They start making the government look bad, and you start prosecuting them. And then what you do is you basically start nailing anybody that makes the government look bad, and you just start knocking off one by one. And this is basically the sole purpose is to make sure that they're all going in line. And this is what becomes a very, very chilling effect. It's not calling certain outlets fake news. No, that has no impact. That is not a war on press. Calling them fake news is not a war on the press. That's basically, you can basically do that all you want. That's called free speech. Doesn't matter what position you have. You can be the president, or you can be some person living in some in whatever neighborhood in America. It's just called free speech. But when you start basically arresting people for actually engaging in journalism, that's when you actually have an actual problem on your hands. And when you basically are willing to use the IMF system and try to basically use this to extort out journalists to basically that made the government look bad, that's an actual problem. And this was another part of the disagreement that I had with the person. The person thought that people had died from the actual releases of Bradley Manning, now known as what's the name? Chelsea Manning. So they thought, but that's actually been a lie perpetrated by the civilian intelligence. It's actually, when we look at the Pentagon and military intelligence, they've actually told a complete different story. And they've actually shown that no one died and no one was actually injured from the release of this, except egos were injured because it actually exposed what was actually going on during the Iraq War. That's the only thing that actually happened. So when we start to look at this, we realize that what actually occurred was that you had two Reuters journalists were killed. You had, and that this was one of the things that was displayed in it. You had a 5-month-old baby was killed. A 77-year-old woman was killed, and what they did is they bombed the area to make to get rid of the bodies, and this was what was the actual event. Well, when you do things like this is essentially a war crime, and this is what was going on, and we need to understand that this is actually a problem. And when we actually get these releases from a group in the media that's willing to actually showcase what's going on, and I think it's very, very important for the people to understand what's going on, because they should understand if our government's doing something wrong, it should be made public, because we should have the idea with it. We should understand what's really going on. If something's going bad, we should have this idea that we can actually do something about it. And we should have the ability to we should have the ability to actually go out and get our information as the citizens, and have this information of what actually happens. We should have more transparency, because frankly what's happening is, number one, is there's a lot of overclassification of things within the government. Number one is that's what's actually occurring. And what we're actually seeing is they're doing this to basically cover up embarrassing details. And number one. Number two is they're also using classification to cover up illegal details. So when these things happen, I mean, what we're noticing, one thing with it is, like, let's say for instance is the let's look at some things in history. All the information on the JFK case, that's still considered classified. Now, if you actually look at the timeline of that, that's over 60 years ago, and we can guarantee that basically all the people involved in that are dead. And if not are near death. Because the fact is we're talking that they weren't exactly spring chickens at the time of people that would have been involved in it. And it shows that there's people that basically were growing up at the time that remember when that happened, and those people are retired now. This should give you an idea. People that were actually born when that happened are basically getting ready to retire very soon, within the next few years. People that were actually basically in what are we talking, like first in like first grade, those people are like first and second grade, those people are retired. First, second, third grade, those are all people who are retired since that point. So these people are basically the people who are around that are pretty much dead. And if not, they're basically they're pretty much way up there in age. So trust me, releasing any documents from that, it's not going to jeopardize anything. The only thing that'll jeopardize that is what it calls pneumonia for any of these people involved in it. Pneumonia would be a bigger problem than releasing these things, unless the release of this information would give them a massive heart attack. And trust me, a massive heart attack is not exactly taking away any of these people's time, because you got to think, if they were what is it, 20 at the time of it, what are they, 80? That's not exactly a young person. Because if you look at our average age in our country, that's still above the average age of an adult in how long they live. So you're talking that should be a little bit of a key. So that's showing that what they're doing is they're basically trying to keep things sealed, because they don't want things that could be illegal, things that could be embarrassing out there. And this is the way things happen. Now, this is why we talk about wanting things out there that's to the people, and wanting as much information out there to the people, because we don't want these garbage stories coming out to the people of what happened. Because the only things that we get out there on that was basically that's on the Kennedy thing was the magic bullet story. Now, we know that bullets do not turn. This is not the when it comes to Kennedy, we on that one, we know that bullets can't turn. This isn't Who Framed Roger Rabbit. We know that is a complete fabrication. So what we want is the actual full story. And because we have people that basically want to keep everything sealed, and want to keep it sealed forever, we basically have that. Now, these are people who are long dead, that are basically in this, and their excuse is, oh, it's national security. National security? You mean for dead people? There's dead people. Basically, all it is right now is to protect names, and to protect the sanctity of names that could be actually in that, and that's the only thing it does. And that's what they're claiming as national security, because it could actually damage the names of people, and by the release of documents. Because we know potentially you could have names like George Herbert Walker Bush in it, and if that damages his name with it, they don't want that. They never want that to happen. And that this is something that we know that's that is a potential thing that because this is what ends up happening, because as we say, as we've stated before, this is kind of what they're looking at. They're looking at hide. They always want to hide embarrassing details and illegal details, and these are the two things that they want to hide. Because when we look at the whole thing of how we got into Iraq to begin with, such when we go back to Iraq, is they knew it was not even legitimate intelligence. They knew it was false intelligence. They knew it was basically, this was an excuse to go into Iraq because they wanted to remake the area. And they knew that they had nothing to do with 9/11. This is basically, okay, we knew that basically it was the Saudis who attacked us, and yet we, the Saudis, with the Mujahideen, which we basically backed to go after the Soviet Union. But yet we decided, oh, we're going to go after Iraq. Well, Iraq had nothing to do with it. This is basically destabilizing the region. Why do we do that? Well, because the fact is you had backing from a lot of the you had neocons wanting to do this, and you also had overseas another neocon, Benjamin Netanyahu, who wanted to destabilize the region as well. And he's another neocon that actually wanted to destabilize the region. This is the newly re-elected leader of Israel, and he's been notorious for giving out bad intelligence, and for basically coming out with these completely outlandish stories. I mean, I'm surprised he hasn't said that a unicorn told them that Iran is making nuclear weapons. This is how outlandish his stories have been. Because the fact is he's basically as crazy as can be. And if, you can even look at his defense minister. His defense minister stated that Avigdor Lieberman stated that he'd rather have ISIS than Iran. I mean, this is basically the group you're dealing with there. So you're basically dealing with a group of people who support terrorism. So you should ideally look at them and state that they actually support Sunni extremism within the region. And what you're going to get is that's what you're going to that's the outcome you're going to get. And what this means is, this is why you're not going to get much of these points of people that are going to start pursuing. When it comes to actually media, you're not going to get people that are going to want to pursue things that are actually truthful. This is why when it comes out to stuff on him, you're going to get there's a lot of corruption when it comes with him, and he doesn't want these things out there. And he's been another one to attack the media as well. And he doesn't, and he's been notorious for attacking media. And this is why when it comes down to it, we need legitimate media to actually release these documents to make sure that we know exactly what's happening around the globe. And this is one thing where Wikimedia is WikiLeaks is a major force for the media, because basically what they focus on is primary sources. They give these primary sources out there, and it's up to it's up for analysis for each individual of what the actual importance is for these primary sources. Now, there's going to be a lot of essentially when these sources are leaked with it, there's going to be a lot of things that are actually were actually used for false intelligence, obviously. And people are going to, and people that have actually gone into saying, oh, but what about these things like false intelligence? Yes, there are false intelligence out there, but it's important to have this because this is actually details part of the actual real history. You need to really see what's going on behind the scenes. And this is actually very, very important to understanding what's going on, because when you see this, you're going to kind of see what's really there, as opposed to what they want, what the propaganda from the corporate media gives you. They're just going to give you what the government wants you to see in the front, which is going to be a lot of smoke. It's going to be this little smoke screen that they end up portraying, and that's the whole problem. And you're going to see all of this garbage, and this is the actual whole problem. And we need to understand this and understand that where this issue is coming from. And we need to understand that that's an actual issue that we need to deal with. And that's the problem that we're actually coming across with the government. And it's not just the U.S. government; it's other governments abroad, and that's why WikiLeaks is not just attacking the U.S. The U.S. They're actually going after other ones abroad. And when people go, oh, they're working with the Russian government, well, I hate to tell you this, but they've already released over 660,000 plus documents of the Russian government. That's not exactly working with the Russian government. If by working with them you mean actually working against them, then okay, then they're working with the Russian government. But if you're releasing documents of the from the Russian government and releasing things that they don't want released, well, that's not exactly something that working with the Russian government would be viewed as. So they're not exactly, they're hardly a Russian agent. And this is just basically, these are just, but those were just basically myths that were actually put forth by the Democrats and their IT people, CrowdStrike, who actually hated the Russians to begin with. They actually had hatred of Russia and Ukraine, and they came up with this myth to actually blame people, to actually blame a group, and this was essentially what they did. Instead of actually stating what really happened, was it was actually a remote download, basically meaning at the actual site. They didn't want to state that it was actually done on site and not abroad, because we actually know that for it to be done abroad, it would have taken way too long, and that doesn't coincide with the actual evidence that we actually have. And even with what actually pings out there with it, we know that it's the only things that actually pinged into the DNC were only things from within the U.S. That goes out to the, I believe it's within the Northeast and within San Francisco. Those are the only areas that actually pinged in, and that means that's not Russia. That's far from Russia. That was not even outside the U.S. And those likely people that were actually already working with the DNC themselves, that were actually working with them remotely, and likely the one of the ones out in the Northeast was likely that would have been likely Clinton, because she had her own server. That would have been likely the one that was pinging out there. And the one out in Frisco would have likely been Minority Leader at the time, Pelosi, from her own office. That's likely because that would have been most likely your biggest leader out in the region. that would have been most likely the only point which it would have pinged out there, or would have pinged out there from talking with any group from social media. If you were talking with a social media conglomerate, that would have been likely what it would have been talking to. If you would have been talking to, let's say, one of the social media groups, that would have been likely where it would have pinged at, such as like a Facebook, a Twitter, or something like that. Facebook, Twitter, Google. If you would have been referring to one of those groups, that would have been likely where it would have pinged at. And that's why we know that it's likely that what the actual thing was, it was a direct download. It was not going to, the only things that it was that it was likely a direct download on a thumb drive, because of the download speeds that were known at the time. And when we get to this is why when we talk about the actual freedom of the press, we should understand that that this should be very, very important. That we should understand that this is a very big idea for how we deal with it. We should not be taking the idea of saying that, oh, the government should be able to control all documents. Well, if they're able to control all documents, then all we're going to get out is propaganda. And that is not going to be good for anybody. And we should understand that unless we're going to get access to primary sources, and this includes, basically, this would include the Constitution itself. This would essentially block the Constitution from the people. This would essentially immediately stop printing of the Constitution, because it is a government document, and potentially have to confiscate the constitutions that have already been disseminated out to people, because they are legal documents then. Even though they've already been printed and done from a third party, most likely. This is really what is actually considered as being that scary. And essentially, you could essentially not even remind the government of their own limitations, being the Constitution is a rule book for the actual government. And the government could essentially say, no, we're not. Only we're in charge of our own rule book. You're not allowed to see it. And that's something that's very, very scary. And we should realize that if we take that position, and this is something that we should realize, that the idea that documents should actually be available. And this is why we should be considering, number one, less classification. When we start doing this with it, we need less classification on these documents, because that's something that's very, very dangerous when we start getting people that are saying, okay, we need all these documents classified. Well, why? Oh, because it makes us look bad. Well, the fact is, we need to start going through things and seeing which ones are actually legitimately need classification. They need to start declassifying things that have nothing to do with it. Once an operation is over, and once people are out of harm's way, such as being retired, being out of harm's way completely, is you can end it. And also, you don't need as much classification if we were to end civilian intelligence. This is another point that could be easily made, because civilian intelligence does put us in a lot more harm's way. And this is something that needs to be understood. And we can easily go and understand that civilian intelligence is something that is a very dangerous thing as well. and it's something that does put people in harm's way, but it's because of our foreign policy. It's not because of some media company disseminating data. It's because of the actual foreign policy. When you're going with a interventionist foreign policy, that's what's actually causing it. It has nothing to do with an actual with the media itself distributing these documents. It has 100% to do with the media itself going and distributing out its actual documents and basically treating people as if they were basically classifying documents and then basically sending people out there to commit these unlawful acts overseas, to basically intervene in other countries they have no business being in. And that's the whole point. And if we're actually going to respect sovereignty of other nations, we do not have to worry about this. And that's where this whole thing boils down to. And if we were to actually do this, we would realize in the end that this would essentially fix the whole problem. Because we don't really need to be doing all this, and it's something very, very simple. And I think that we can actually come with an idea of understanding that when we get to freedom of the press, we need to understand that they're not doing anything illegal. They're essentially, all they're doing is giving people the idea of what our government's doing. And the government needs to realize what they're doing is wrong. And they should be the ones that are actually accountable for their own actions. And we're not seeing this, and that's the actual problem. They're going, oh, how dare you release this information? Well, no, it's not how dare you release this information. It's how dare you actually had the gall to eliminate, to basically tell people that they're not allowed to see this information. And because it embarrasses you, you are doing things illegal. And this is the whole point. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, make sure you share us all around social media. Make sure you check out my Patreon page. If you can't donate, make sure to share with someone else who can. And that's about it. And I will see you guys later, hopefully. Bye, everyone.